If it's worth doing, then it's probably worth overdoing. Hey guys, it's Uncle Fester and I'm coming to you from my garage instead of my music room today because I've got something out of the ordinary planned. I'm neck deep in a project I've been preparing for almost 5 years now. A massive Celestion Vintage 30 speaker shootout. Possibly the biggest one ever. I've put the usual timestamps in the description below for navigation purposes if you want to skip this introduction or the test setup. Unfortunately, this video requires a lot of talking and explaining because I want to be completely open and transparent with you. I'm going to explain to you exactly what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and why I'm doing it. I'm going to explain my methodology. The short version is I'll be shooting out over 50 Celestion Vintage 30 speaker types by reamping them through the same setup and creating frequency response graphs using Room EQ Wizard. I'll provide the recorded tracks and the graphs in the description below for you to download so you can evaluate them yourself too. Nobody wants to listen to the same reamped riff 50 times in a row, so this video is mostly going to be talking, discussing graphs, and listening to selected sound samples. But for those of you who love pain, I'm going to stick the recorded riffs at the end of the video, which will probably murder my average viewer retention statistic. Obviously, I love the Celestion Vintage 30 speaker, but there are so many myths, so many ill-informed opinions, just so much bullshit about that speaker out there that usually isn't backed up by anything at all. And there are many shootout videos on YouTube as well, but unfortunately, the vast majority of those ignore important parameters. So having been a test engineer in the past, I've decided to get to the bottom of the V30 mystery myself. Do UK-made speakers sound different than Chinese-made ones? Do newer ones sound different than older ones? Do the Mesa Boogie and Marshall versions sound different than the standard ones? Is there a tonal difference between 8 ohm and 16 ohm models? I'm going to try to find out. Over the last 5 years, I've collected vintage 30s and Marshall G12 vintages from all eras in 8 and 16 ohms, from 2021 all the way back as far as 1986, as well as several Mesa, Marshall and Bad Cat OEM V30s, and a bunch of exotics too, like Black Frame and 1777 comb vintage 30s, and the Marshall vintage 30 MFs. In total, I have 50 vintage 30 and G12 vintage speakers here, as well as 3 TAD 25th anniversary speakers, which I suspect are relabeled Dave Mustaine vintage 30s. And I will document them all by recording some reamp riffs to them and making frequency response graphs of each and every one of them using the same setup. I will upload all recordings and frequency response graphs into a Dropbox folder or something like that and link it in the description for you to run your own analysis and nerd out with me from the comfort of your own home. This is the test setup I'll be using. All of the speakers will be going into this Gossman SG box ISO cab with a single Shure SM57 pointed roughly at where the dust cap meets the cone of the speaker, as that seems to be a very popular position. The microphone is as close to the speaker as I can get away with without risking bumping into the microphone when changing out the speakers. Now you might be wondering why an ISO cab. Wouldn't a regular cab sound better? Maybe, yes, but this isn't about getting the best sound, it's about ensuring the same test conditions for every speaker. And the risk of accidentally moving something like the mic or the mic stand while cycling through 53 speakers is just too high with a conventional setup. Also, the ISO cab allows me to isolate the test setup from the room and anything in it. Of course, there's still a risk of bumping into the mic, so I had to make sure that it was mounted as securely as possible. My first idea didn't work, so I consulted the old engineering flowchart and grabbed tape. Tape is one of the best tools in the universe. It keeps the world together and it can fix any and everything, even total hair loss through autoimmune conditions. But I'm getting off topic here. The reamp tracks will be sent out from my Focusrite Scarlett 6i6 second generation, going into the 2 nodes Torpedo Reload, and from there into my EVH 5153, either on the red channel for high gain tones or the green channel for clean tones. I chose the EVH for this because it provides very agreeable tones. Most people like it, and even more people are familiar with its tonal character. Also, its red channel is pretty tight without an OD boosting it. I don't want to use an OD here as I want to keep the test setup as simple as possible. To create the frequency response graphs, I'll be using Room EQ Wizard. The test signal will go out from a separate output of my Scarlett into my KSR PA50 power amp and into the speaker in the ISO cab. At this point, the frequency sweep is picked up by the same SM57 in the same position as before. Now you might think, wouldn't a solid state power amp and a calibrated measurement mic be more scientific? Yes, probably, but I'm not a scientist, I'm an engineer, and I also don't have either of those. Looking at all these speakers, you might think I'm rich, but no, I'm just irresponsible. But unfortunately, I've used the word scientific now, so I'm going to have to put on a lab coat to give myself more credibility. The Ushanka is for warmth, it's cold in my garage. Also, I enjoy funny hats. And in most situations where it really matters, you will be hearing the speaker through an SM57 or a Sennheiser or a Biodynamic or some other common mic anyway. Now, let's get a glimpse at the speakers and I'll tell you what analysis I intend to run. First of all, I want to try to get an idea for the production tolerances, meaning the variations that the speakers have that should be the same on paper. To do that, I'm going to look and listen to speaker pairs, primarily speakers that have the same exact production date, as well as a couple of speakers that were made in the same year in the same country. What I'm hoping to find is that within the individual pairs, the speakers don't differ too drastically from one another. Next, I want to compare the standard 8-ohm T3903 throughout the years, from 86, 91, 95, 2000, 2002, all the way up to 2021, and see if there are noticeable differences throughout its almost 40 years of production, and find out if there are any noticeable tonal shifts at some points. After that, I want to compare 8 and 16 ohm vintage 30s from the same production year to see if there are consistent tonal shifts between the voice coil impedances. Then I want to compare Marshall, Mesa Boogie and Bad Cat OEM versions to standard V30s of the same production year and impedance to try and find out what the defining characteristics of the OEM versions are, if there are any. And finally, I have one standard 8-ohm vintage 30 from 2016 that for some reason was made in the UK. I'm going to compare that to a Chinese 8-ohm vintage 30 that was made in 2016 as well. Also, I have two 8-ohm vintage 30s from 2002, of which one was made in China and one was made in the UK. Let's see how that turns out. Now, two samples are probably not really enough to draw any meaningful conclusions, not statistically relevant anyway, but it's very difficult to find speakers from the UK and China that were made in the same year and have the same product code. And as a bonus, I might compare some of the exotic V30 variants I have to standard V30. I will provide an Excel file listing and identifying all the speakers from this test, as well as a list of all the analysis you will be seeing after this in the description below. Before we get to the actual speaker test, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that is Glenn Fricker and the new Celestion Vintage 30s. A while back, Glenn made a video in which he compared a Celestion Vintage 30 from 2022 to the stock Vintage 30 from his Engel cab, which I believe was dated 2006. Now, Glenn determined that the new speaker sounded much better than the older one and that Celestion must have changed the design of the speaker. And since I was going to punish myself with this test anyway, I decided to investigate that. So I ordered a pair of brand new Celestion Vintage 30s from TubeAmp Doctor just last week, and here they are. Now, I believe the speakers in Glenn's video were dated February 25th, 2022. Now, despite me ordering these just last week, they seem to be half a year older than the ones in Glenn's video. These are dated August 13th, 2021. However, they appear to be packed the same way as the speakers in Glenn's video, in this pouch here. And more important than that, they seem to have that transparent dust cap he was talking about. So I'm just going to assume they're made the same way. And say about Glenn Fricker what you want. The man has a point. The dust caps do look different. Here is an 8-ohm speaker from 2019. Check this out. Here's the 2021 in comparison. The speaker that's 2 years older has a completely different looking dust cap. It's much darker, so he's right. And secondly, I think he might be onto something. I never really paid much attention to the dust cap, but after his video I took a closer look. Here's an 8-ohm from 2002. It is also pretty dark, just like the one from 2019, but here's one from 1995. That's much clearer, see? Here's one from 1986. That one looks different again. It's smaller and it's much more pointy. Probably doesn't come across on camera. Here's another example. This is a Marshall Celestion Vintage 30 MF. This dust cap is flat as a pancake. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take photos of every speaker in this shootout, including a close-up picture of the dust cap, and if we can measure or record any tonal differences, I'm going to see if we can link that to the type of dust cap used. Maybe Glenn's onto something. Now, I've got a ton of busy work to do. See you guys on the other side. Alright guys, I'm back inside. I'm wearing my scientific credentials. I've run all the tests, I've listened to all the audio, I've compared all the graphs, and I want to show you some selected results now. However, if you want to form your own opinion, you can download all the tracks, all the graphs, all the data in the description below, as I've probably mentioned for the 46th time in this video. So let's jump into the Reaper project I set up for the presentation here. So I'm always going to be comparing two tracks with each other. I've got them set up here. I'm using this plugin by Nugent Audio, I suppose that's how it's pronounced, and it's called AB Assist, that allows me to switch back and forth between two tracks seamlessly. I also have an instance of Voxengo Span Plus running here that makes a live FFT of both of the tracks playing at all times. And that will show us how much of each frequency is in the track. There's got to be a more intelligent way to say that, but for the life of me, I can't think of one right now. And finally, on the master here, I have an instance of Brainworks BX Clean Sweep Pro that allows me to set up very aggressive high and low pass filters in case I want to hone in on certain frequency bands, listen to just the mids by themselves, for example, or just the highs. Let's jump in. Okay, let's start with the pair test. The idea behind this test was to get a feeling for the production tolerances, meaning how different do two speakers sound that should be the same on paper because they're from the same production batch, or in some cases at least made in the same year. So I'd expect them to sound similarly on paper. I've got the tracks from pairs lined up here from 1986, 1995, the year 2000, and 2021, the new Celestion Vintage 30s, as well as tracks from two Mesa Boogie spec Celestion Vintage 30s from 2008. These aren't from the same batch, but they were made in the same year. Let's start with 1986. And when I click this button, it switches over to the other track. That's quite a difference already. Let's take a look at the sweeps that I made with Room EQ Wizard for them. Okay, these are the Room EQ measurements of the two speakers from 1986, and the shapes are pretty similar. There's a slight volume difference between 1 and maybe 2 dB depending on where you look, but the shapes are pretty much the same all the way up to about 1.4, 1.5 kilohertz. Then they start to vary a bit more in the high mids here. Presence range is similar again, but in the brilliance range here, that's where it gets messy. They do look a bit different. And did you pay attention to Voxengo Span while the tracks were playing? Let's look at that again. Look at that. That's pretty much bang on. When I noticed this, I was delighted because two tools independently from each other are giving us the same result, or a very similar result at least. That really gives the Room EQ Wizard measurements credibility, in my opinion. Let's listen to that again and adjust the volume a bit. Let's take about 1.5 dB off this one. Let's isolate the mids. That's sounding very close to each other. Let's listen to the high ends. I hope you can hear that. Even though the main differences between the two speakers appear to be in this range here, which is very high frequency, and also at a considerably lower sound pressure level than this meat and potatoes area here, I think that's where the main differences are coming from that we're hearing. Now, the question is, how relevant would that be in a mix? Because most mixing guides recommend low passing around the 10 kilohertz area. Let's check out the other years. Let's check out the 1995s. Slightly different shape around here. Let's listen to just the mids. That's almost indistinguishable. Just the highs. Noticeable difference. Let's just listen to the presence. Slight difference. Let's check out the year 2000s. Okay, these sound much closer to me. Let's check out the mids by themselves. Okay, I can't tell any difference at all between those two. Again, the main difference seems to be coming from the high end of the spectrum. These sounded very close to each other. Let's move on to the pair from 2021. Close, but there is a noticeable difference. Let's check out the mids by themselves again. Indistinguishable from each other. Finally, let's check out the Mesa Boogie speakers from 2008. Noticeably different. Let's isolate the mids once more. Bang on the same. All right, what's the takeaway so far? There are noticeable differences in speaker pairs, meaning speakers from the same production batch. They sound different. And the difference doesn't appear to be so much in the mid-spectrum, but in the high-frequency spectrum, the presence and the brilliance range. The spread seems to be increased in older speakers made before the year 2000. And I have a couple of theories why that might be the case that I'll get into later. Also, it seems that these curves are pretty much the same in all speakers up to roughly 1.3, 1.5K. Then the differences start to get bigger. We see some shifts in the peaks and valleys. Some speakers develop more peaks up here or pretty deep valleys like here. Generally, they seem to diverge further from each other the higher the frequency gets. And given the medium we're working with here, that does make a lot of sense to me because the cones of these speakers are effectively made of paper, cellulose, natural fibers, and inevitably those will vary in their constitution. And the frequencies we're looking at here, say 8,000 hertz, that's 8,000 events per second created by a piece of paper. So the slightest difference in the constitution of the paper will affect that. I'm actually quite surprised how consistently they can make these up here in the double-digit kilohertz area. But how do we evaluate these differences? We need to put them in context. So let's move on to the era test, which is where we compare 8 ohm Celestion vintage 30s, the T3903 model, throughout the years. For the sake of this test, I've grouped my speakers into 3 rough eras. The era before the year 2000, which I can cover from 1986 to 1995. The Nolly golden era from 2000 to 2004. Actually, he says 2000 to 2003, but I have a couple of 2004s here as well, and they fit that era more than the third, which is the modern era, everything after 2004. Let's listen to a few examples here. Let's start by comparing one of the 1986 speakers to the new ones, the 2021 ones. So in this test, A is the first speaker, in this case 1986, and B is the second speaker, one of the 2021 speakers, speaker number 50. Let's listen to that. Okay, noticeable difference. Let's compare it to the other 2021 speaker. Okay, again, quite different. Let's compare 1986 to 1995. A is 86, B is 95. Now, that is a massive shift. Look at this area right here. '86 peaks for 95 dips. Okay, I don't think we need to hone in to specific frequencies to evaluate that. Let's compare 86 to the year 2000. A is 86, B is 2000. And again, we see this difference here. It's not as exaggerated as it was with the 1995 one, but it's noticeable. 2000 to 2004. Okay, we can see the difference in the high end there, but up until the end of the presence range, they're pretty much the same. 2000 versus 2003. Again, just differences in the very high end here. 2002 versus 2003. Okay, let's compare 2003 to 2021, the smoother of the two sounding, speaker 49. Okay, the smoother of the two speakers to one of the 2019 ones. Those speakers are 2 years apart and they sound very different to each other. But these sound samples are all fine and good. But if you're like me, you're probably losing context right now and not seeing the forest for the trees just because there's so many speakers to compare here. So what I did was I put the different eras into the same window in Room EQ Wizard and exported the JPEG so that we can look at these groups of speakers. And I've cut out the low mids here. We're just looking at the mid spectrum all the way up to 15 kilohertz because I don't think anything over 15 kilohertz will have much of an effect in the mix. And basically the graphs are very close to each other up to 1.5K anyway. So these are the speakers from 86 to 95. And we can see there's a big spread here in the 5 to 6K area. These are the speakers from the year 2000 to 2004. And these are all the speakers after that. What's not in here now are the speakers from 2008 and 2010. I didn't put those in because I thought they would represent their own era, but when investigating further, it turned out they pretty much fit in here. And if we jump back and forth quickly, we can see a few things. Look at this area around between 5 and 6K. These are the early 2000s, and these are the ones after that. And you can see here that there's a big difference in the area between 5 and 6K. The newer speakers are much more present here with the exception of one, and that is speaker 49. That one fits right in with the year 2000 speakers. Let me show you one graph. This is a speaker from 2003 in red and the smoother of the two 2021 speakers in green. And you can see they're pretty much bang on. Same with one from the year 2000, the 2021 speakers in green and the year 2000 speakers in purple here. It fits right in with those, even in the 5 to 6 kilohertz area here. Let's keep that in mind for later. Funnily enough, the thing with the three eras kind of works out. We have the speakers before the year 2000 here that have a pretty wide spread here. And I think that could be down to use or how these were stored. They might drift in this area. The older they get, the more they are played. However, I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, because we see there's these big spreads here in speaker pairs as well. These are speakers that I bought together as pairs. So it's fair to assume that they were used the same way and that they were stored the same way. And yet they drift they're pretty far away from each other in this area. So I think it could be down to production quality. I grew up in a workshop environment in the 90s, and even though it's a different industry, I think mentalities through all industries with regards to production processes have changed quite a bit in the last few years. And you can see here the newer speakers, they're much closer together in general. So I think the early or the speakers before the year 2000 vary quite a bit because Celestion and or Kurt Müller just couldn't make them as well back then. But that's just an assumption. The other takeaway is Nolly's right. These early 2000 speakers, they have a signature to them. They have this subdued 5 to 6K range here. And if we jump back and forth, we can see they seem to have this little bump here in the mid-range above that. Another thing I'd like to point out is the 2004 speakers here, which are blue and orange here, these here, they have a similar character in this 5 to 6K range, but they get much more spiky up in the high end here. And that's pretty much in line with what Nolly said. Okay, let's move on to the next test. And that is the 16 versus 8 ohm test. I've got 4 years here in which I have both 8 and 16 ohm speakers, and I've lined them up here. Those years are the year 2000, 2002, 2008, and 2019. Let's take a quick listen and then we'll look at some graphs. Let's start with the year 2000. A is always the 16 ohm speaker and B is the 8 ohm speaker. Let's start with the year 2000 here. Okay, there's a noticeable difference here, but it's more subtle in the year 2000 speakers than it is in the others. Let's check out the year 2002s. Okay, 2008. Again, A is 16 ohms, B is 8 ohms. And finally, year 2019. You might have suspicion listening to these. Let's confirm that by looking at some graphs. Again, I exported these as JPEGs because it just makes them easier to compare quickly. This is a graph of the year 2000 speakers. I have two 16 ohm V30s in here and one 8 ohm V30. The 8 ohm V30 is orange. You can see here the orange speaker just has the tiniest bit more mid-range. It's less apparent in the high mids here, except here a bit. And the 16 ohm speakers both poke out here in the 5 to 6K area and again in the 7 to 9K area. But the effect was less subtle in the year 2000 speakers. Let's look at the 2002 ones. So for the year 2002, I have two 8 ohm speakers and one 16 ohm speaker. The 16 ohm speaker is orange here. And you can see there's a substantial low end difference here up to about 130 hertz. I observed that in a lot of speakers. I don't think that has anything to do with the 16 versus 8 ohm speakers. That's just kind of a tolerance that happens now and then. But you can see both 8 ohm speakers have noticeably more mids here. And again, the orange 16 ohm speaker kind of pokes out here between 4 and 5K. Interesting enough, the 8 ohm speaker 21 is pretty present in the 5 to 6K area here as well. This is the year 2019, and here I have, again, two 8 ohm speakers, one 16 ohm speaker. The 16 ohm speaker is orange again. And again, we can observe that the mid-spectrum here is lower. And again, the 16 ohm speaker pops out between 5 and 6K here. And this is the 2008 measurement. I only have one of each here. And again, you can see the 16 ohm speaker, which is purple here, noticeably less mid-range. And it pops out here between 5 and 6K. Do you see a pattern? I think I do. And you can take almost any 8 ohm and 16 ohm measurement from this test and put them in the same graph here. In almost every case, the 16 ohm speaker will have less mids than the 8 ohm speaker. It doesn't always have more high end. That depends on the year. Some years tend to have more high end anyway, but the mid-range thing, that seems to be true. 16 ohm speakers have less mids. And that brings us maybe to the most interesting part of this test, where we compare Mesa Boogie spec vintage 30s and Marshall spec vintage 30s, which are called G12 vintages, to regular vintage 30s, mostly made from China, and UK-made V30s versus Chinese-made V30s. Let's compare a 2004 Mesa Boogie to a regular Chinese-made vintage 30, both 8 ohms. A is the Mesa Boogie one, and B is the regular one. Okay, that's a big difference in the high end. However, the cone stamps on these speakers indicate to me that my 2004 Mesa Boogie spec vintage 30 is in fact much closer to my 2003 regular one. So let's compare that 2004 Mesa Boogie speaker to a 2003 regular vintage 30. A is the Mesa speaker, B is the regular one from 2003. There's still a bit of a difference, not as much as before, but I'd almost say the difference is within the regular production specs. Let's check out that Mesa speaker versus the other 2003 speaker. About the same difference. Now let's check out a 2008 Mesa Boogie speaker versus a 2008 standard one. Again, A is the Mesa, B is the standard one. Okay, let's check out a different 2008 Mesa Boogie versus the same standard one. A is the Mesa Boogie one. That's pretty damn close. 2010 Mesa Boogie versus 2010 standard vintage 30. A is the Mesa Boogie, B is the standard one. Okay, the standard one seems to be a bit louder, so I'm going to take a dB off that. Okay, I have a 2001 Mesa Boogie vintage 30. Unfortunately, I don't have a regular vintage 30 from 2001, but I have a UK-made one from the year 2000. A is the Mesa Boogie one from 2001. B is the standard from the year 2000. Okay, let's compare a 2020 Mesa Boogie speaker to a regular vintage 30 from 2019. A is the Mesa speaker, B is the regular one. Pretty damn close. Okay, that's all the 8 ohm Mesas I have. Let's compare an 8 ohm Marshall from 2017 to a regular vintage 30 from 2018. A is the Marshall, B is the standard one. Slight difference there. Let's compare that same 2017 Marshall speaker to a stock vintage 30 from 2016. now for an interesting one, I have an 8 ohm Marshall G12 vintages from 1989. Let's compare one of those to a regular Celestion Vintage 30 from 1991. Sadly, that's the closest one I have. A is the Marshall, B is the stock. Let's supplement that by comparing that same 89 Marshall speaker to a Celestion Vintage 30 from 1986. Ideally, I would have wanted to show you the difference between 16 ohm Marshall speakers to the regular ones, but unfortunately I noticed that both the 16 ohm Marshall speakers I had were damaged. One had repair damage in the speaker suspension, which seems to have shifted the low end a bit, and the other one had repair damage in the cone, sadly. I didn't see an immediate difference in the graphs with that one, but still it has repair damage and it's kind of out of contention because of that. Let's move on to the UK versus China section of this test. I have two speakers from the same year, of which one was made in the UK and one was made in China. Those years are 2002 and 2016. Let's compare a 2002 UK-made speaker to a 2002 Chinese-made speaker. A is the UK speaker, B is the Chinese speaker. The UK-made speaker sounds a bit smoother. Let's compare that same Chinese speaker to a UK speaker made in the year 2000, just for some more references. A is the UK speaker, B the Chinese one. I added this comparison of the 2002 Chinese speaker to the UK-made speaker from the year 2000 because speaker 14, which is the UK-made speaker from the year 2002, appears to be somewhat of an outlier. It looks a bit weird compared to the others. It has a good bit less low end and very little high end and little going on above 10K. I suspect it might have been used a lot. So it's starting to fall off maybe. Let's compare the 2016 speakers. This is 2016 UK versus 2016 China. A is UK, B is China. Okay, the Chinese speaker from 2016 seems to have a lot less high end. Again, a bit of an outlier in this test, unfortunately, so I've added a comparison between the 2016 UK speaker and the Chinese speaker from 2018. A is the 2016 UK speaker, B is the Chinese speaker from 2018. Let's... Alright, what's the takeaway of this test? There are differences, but they're very subtle, and I think they're pretty much within the regular production tolerances. I can't make out a specific characteristic that defines the Mesa version or the Marshall version, and the differences between the UK-made and the Chinese speakers here seems within the regular production tolerances as well. It's a little demystifying. I'm a little disappointed, to be honest. I was hoping for big differences. I was hoping that the Mesa and the Marshall speakers were in fact special, but it doesn't seem like it to me. Okay, before we move on to the conclusion, I just want to show you some of the exotic vintage 30 speakers I have here. Nope. Hey guys, it's several days later, even more tired me here. And at this point in the video, I had actually planned on showing you the exotic vintage 30s I have, like the Bad Cat OEMs, the Black Frames, the Marshall V30 MFs, the Tubam Doctor 25th anniversary speakers, the 1777 Cohen V30s, and whatever else I've forgotten now. But I had to admit to myself that my main motivations for presenting these is I'm just dying to talk about them because I think they're cool and interesting. But I had to concede to myself that presenting these speakers wouldn't really help in answering the big questions about the vintage 30, but would actually represent a bit of a detour. Also, this video and video format is completely uncharted territory for me, and I'm getting nervous about the length of it, to be honest. So I'm not going to show these speakers in that video. You can, however, download all the information, sound clips, graphs, and all that stuff in the description below. If you would like to see a dedicated video about the exotic V30s, just let me know in the comments. All right, let's wrap this up. Righto, time to summarize, conclude, and to speculate. The vintage 30 tone varies quite a bit, even in speakers from the same batch. Although, most speakers with the same impedance were pretty much identical up to roughly the 1.5 kHz mark, and still very similar to each other up to about 4 kHz. Above that is where the variances really kick in. The high-end character of the speaker seems to be very difficult to reproduce accurately. The evidence seems pretty clear on the 8 ohms versus 16 ohms speaker debate. The 16 ohm speakers in this test generated lower sound pressure levels in the mids and tended to have elevated high ends. Due to the tolerances of the speakers, the high end thing wasn't the case 100% of the time, but I can definitely see a trend there. And that is in line with both Ignacio from Jensen and Nolly said in their respective videos on Christian Kohle's YouTube channel. The results of this test indicate that Nolly's right about the early 2000 speakers. They tend to be more rolled off in the 5 to 6 kHz area than speakers before or after that era. Nolly also said that the 2004 speakers tend to sound more industrial and that the voicing of the speakers changes slightly after that, and I believe my test confirms this. The effect of speaker break-in remains difficult to quantify and further testing is needed. Some of the speakers in this test are well used, while others were new or almost new, and yet I wasn't able to make out a specific characteristic in the graphs for speaker break-in. The wise people of the internet tend to claim that the high end of the speakers becomes less harsh with break-in. Ignacio from Jensen, on the other hand, said in his video on Kohle's channel that that's not the case. It's the lows and the mids that go up in level, creating the impression of less harsh highs. Now, pretty much all the speakers in my test had very similar levels in the lows and the mids. And the high end varied in all speakers. The newer speakers didn't necessarily have more high end than older speakers. I'm going to be controversial here for a moment because I'm not 100% convinced speaker break-in really exists. At least not in the way it's described in a lot of internet forums. The explanations for it make sense to me, yet I've never experienced it myself, nor have I seen evidence of it happening. At the same time, I trust the experts like Nolly or Ignacio from Jensen about it, even if they have slightly different takes on break-in. While I think Ignacio said 20 to 30 hours of playing at band volume constitutes a good break-in, Nolly said in his video that he thinks there's not much to be had in the first 100 hours. That doesn't necessarily have to be a contradiction though. Nolly's talking about Celestions while Ignacio is probably talking about Jensen's predominantly. Those speakers are different designs and they're made in different factories, so maybe they have different break-in characteristics. Or maybe they're not even talking about the same kind of break-in. I don't know. My 2021 speakers are new, so I'm going to do a test with them. I'm going to put the smoother of the two speakers, number 49, aside, and I'm going to reamp the bejesus out of speaker number 50 for a few weeks. I'm going to make room EQ measurements every week or every 25 hours or so to see if the tone shifts at some point. If and when the tone shifts, I'm going to take that speaker, speaker 50, put that aside, and start punishing speaker number 49 the same way to see if that tone shifts as well, and if it shifts the same way. So stay tuned, but this will take a while. I might get to it sometime later this year. The current Celestion Vintage 30s can sound reminiscent of the golden age, the early 2000s. One of my two 2021 speakers behaved very similarly to an early 2000 speaker. The other one, on the other hand, not so much. That was more like the other modern Vintage 30s. Now, I don't have enough data to confidently draw any conclusions about the new Celestion Vintage 30s. Glenn Fricker's 2022 speaker sounded a lot better than his 2006 speaker. Maybe my 2021 speakers are right from that point in time when they begin to sound like that again. Or maybe production tolerances at the moment are so that you might get lucky and receive a speaker that sounds like that. So you might get lucky with a new V30. I'd need more new speakers to test to confirm that. I might look into that later, who knows. The dust caps on my vintage 30s here varied quite a bit. Some were dark, some were almost transparent, some were soft, some were hard, some felt pretty brittle, but I couldn't find a correlation between the dust caps used and the tonal character of the individual speakers. Now, that doesn't have to mean that the dust cap doesn't have an influence on tone, it just means that further testing is required. And I intend to do that. I have dust caps here. These are made of paper, these are made of fabric. I have special glue, a heat gun and a scalpel somewhere here, and I intend to sacrifice one of my V30s and run it without a dust cap entirely and then glue these on to see if that changes the tone in any way. It appeared that the older speakers in this test had far more tonal variance than the newer speakers, and there's a few possible explanations for that. The first one is that the Marshall G12 Vintage, the Celestion Vintage 30, or the black frame Vintage 30s, which you didn't hear in this video, actually had different designs back in the day. But that doesn't seem very likely to me. I can't think of a good reason why Celestion would do that. However, it could also be that I just didn't have enough samples for this period. I had far more speakers to cover the other eras than this early era, so it could also be that the variances increase with age or use. However, again, the fact that the pairs diverge so greatly in some cases doesn't really support that either. One would expect that they would age in a similar way, but they don't have to necessarily. That's speculation on my part. The most probable explanation to me is that production tolerances probably weren't as tight in the 80s and 90s. Production processes have changed in pretty much every industry in the last few decades. And I believe that the increasingly narrower tolerance band that I recorded with the newer speakers in this test support that idea. Again, more testing needed, but not from me. This particular mystery doesn't really bother me that much, and speakers that age, vintage 30s that age, are kind of difficult to find these days. There does not appear to be a distinctive difference between Mesa OEM's Marshall G12 vintages and regular vintage 30s. At least I wasn't able to find one. All the speakers sounded different to each other in this test. Sometimes the Mesa Boogie sounded a bit smoother, sometimes the standard one sounded a bit smoother to me. But the differences between them weren't of a higher magnitude than the differences between two speakers of the same batch would be, in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying there is no difference, I'm just saying I wasn't able to find one. Either way, I was not able to identify any specific characteristics in the graphs that would constitute a tonal signature, like all Mesas being smooth on top, all Marshalls being brighter. Nope, nothing like that. Now that raises the question, why would the Mesa Boogie speaker get a different product code than the regular speaker back in the day when all speakers were made in England and had the same labels and everything? Well, I have a theory about that, and it's stupid, but I want to share it with you nonetheless. One of the Mesa Boogie speakers I ordered directly from Mesa, and shipping and taxes were brutal. However, it came with the label detached, so I had to stick it on myself. I thought that was kind of weird, but during my test, I took a look at my Mesa Boogie speakers, and all of the labels compared to the regular vintage 30s were either stuck on at a 90 degrees clockwise or 90 degrees counterclockwise orientation to the terminals. One of them had a 45-degree orientation as well. And that got me thinking, so I googled Mesa Boogie 412 inside or Mesa Boogie 412 open, and you can see there that in the Mesa Boogie caps, the speakers are either mounted so that the terminals are pointing towards a theoretical vertical axis in the cab, or they're all mounted so that the terminals are pointing at a theoretical center point in the cabinet. But the labels are all stuck on so that the writing is level when you look at the speakers in the back. So I believe it could be that the Mesa Boogie speakers have a different product code so that the guys at Celestion know not to stick the label on the speakers, but to pack it separately so that the guys at Mesa Boogie can stick them on once the speakers are mounted in the cab, so that when you take the back off your Mesa Boogie cab, you have the writing all, oriented levelly so that you can read what's on it. I know it sounds stupid, but think about it. Mesa Boogie cabs are pretty much airtight. They're built to very meticulous standards. I think it kind of fits their character. It fits in. It makes sense to me. Of course, these days, Mesa Boogie speakers are made in the UK and they still have that old style label, unlike the current mass-produced ones in China. That bothers me, by the way. That label by itself does not mean that the speaker was UK made. Really annoys me when people try to sell their Chinese-made speakers at a premium because it has that label. That doesn't mean made in the UK. The Chinese factory used those labels for at least 5 or 6 years before changing them. Speaking of UK speakers, there does not appear to be a distinctive difference between UK-made and Chinese-made speakers if they're made in the same era. The differences are within the normal production tolerances, in my opinion. Unfortunately, the speaker years for which I had both a Chinese and a UK-made speaker, the speakers were slight outliers in both cases, but I compared them to other speakers from that era and they kind of fit in. Again, if you showed me a graph, I wouldn't be able to tell you if it were a Chinese or a UK-made speaker. I can't find any specific identifiers. Maybe you're better at this than me. Take a look at the graphs, tell me if I'm missing something. Same with the OEM speakers. What am I missing? Is there something? Educate me, please. Well, this was an entirely different format for me, and I think I've talked more in this video than I usually would do in a month. To me, it was still a very interesting project, and I learned a lot. This video was full of firsts for me, and I learned a lot about my speakers as well. And depending on how well this video is received, I might make a follow-up on the stuff I learned about the speakers. I don't think I've ever worked on anything this hard without being paid for it. I've been working on this every night for 5 weeks straight, and I hope it shows. I hope you weren't bored to death. I hope it doesn't suck. Do you agree with my conclusions or am I full of shit? Tell me in the comments. Check out the data yourself and educate me. Don't take my opinion as gospel. I'm an idiot, but I'm confident of how I collected the data. If this video was informative to you, entertaining, or you just pity this fool, I'd appreciate it if you could click the like button. The official version is, it helps the video's reach, it gets it in front of more people. The truth is, I've become addicted to the approval of strangers on the internet. Special thanks goes out to my YouTube friends Jacob K Guitar and Ed S, who let me bounce ideas off them and gave me great advice for this. Both of these guys run excellently nerdy YouTube channels. I'll link their channels in the description. Check them out if you're into this kind of stuff. Thanks also to Simon, Kieran and Matthew for great advice, putting up with my shit and or supplying me with memes. And last but not least, thanks to Room EQ Wizard. That tool is amazing. I've worked with tools at work that cost a fortune that aren't as powerful as Room EQ Wizard, and they let you use it for free. They do take donations, however. So if you've got a buck or two and you like this kind of stuff, consider donating to Room EQ Wizard, because I don't think this video would have been possible without that tool. Now, I'm going to take a nap. Then I'm going to build a fort out of the speakers and pretend to be the Vintage 30 King for a while before I sell dozens of them again. As promised, I'm going to leave you with the reamped high gain riffs for every speaker. I hope to see you again in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.